Hello, and welcome back to our podcast, What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And as usual, I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues,
David Kennedy.
And Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. And today, we're here to talk about ambiguous loss. It's a term that's often referred to, but we really want to talk today about what is ambiguous loss? How does it show up in our lives? All of us have actually experienced ambiguous loss pretty much, and we'll experience more of it in our lives. So to begin with, David, I was hoping that you could give us a bit of background around how the term and this area of the field emerged.
One of the unique things around grief theory, etc., is that it's fairly new. I mean, when we think about how grief has been understood, it's only been within the last 70 years or so that the theories have actually been put on paper, and we've studied it as something that needs to be looked at. So there's this growing and always evolving understanding of grief, and in the midst of that, we identify ways in which grief shows up beyond just a death grief. And this ambiguous loss is a term that was coined in the 1970s, by Pauline Boss. She's a therapist. You can YouTube her, you find lots of her writings. But this began in the 70s when she was doing her graduate work. And she talks about taking a course in a family therapy course. And she was observed as these families would come in to talk to a therapist, and how the fathers were often very unhappy about being there, and sometimes weren't there. But if they were there, they weren't happy about being there because they didn't think they should. And so she actually wrote her paper about how that whole idea of fathers, absent fathers from the family model. And then she moved into a sociology course, and her prof liked the phrase that she had come up with around that absent father, and he encouraged her to think about it in a broader sense around loss. And so she talks about how she was at home, and she came up with this idea of ambiguous loss as a descriptor. And that began her journey, and she's the one that coined it. She wrote a book about it and developed it and of course now she's finished her PhD, obviously, and has written much on it. But when she wrote about it, how she was understanding ambiguous loss was that there were two ways in which we could experience that. First of all, the person is present physically, but psychologically they're absent. So we think about ways in which people can be with you but not with you. And then the other side of that were people who were psychologically with us. So they're with us in our heart, our mind, our thoughts, but they're not physically with us. So there's this distinction that happens where ambiguous loss can happen out of either of those kind of trajectories. And it's a way of categorizing. I think it's helped to both legitimize our feelings of grief around the experiences of ambiguous loss, and to legitimize the right for people to have it and find a way to be supported in that.
So thank you, David, for that overview. Just to get a little more, if you'd allow me to get a little more concrete here, let's give some examples about those kind of two categories of physical and psychological. Yeah.
Well, I would say things like Alzheimer's and dementia would be a form of ambiguous loss. As you were talking, I just thought of one that I hadn't thought of before. Foster care and adoption,
Big one. Big one.
That's a huge one. What do we not have rituals for? What kind of losses do we not acknowledge? I think of young people on the street who are out there, and their parents might not even know where they are anymore, and those parents are wondering, where's my child? And they're living on the street, and they've lost contact, and so...
And there can be loss, there's loss on both sides there, right?
Yep.
So for the person living on the street, the loss of maybe that physical connection with their family or the stability of that, but also for that family that's psychologically that person's still very much alive for them, but they do not have that connection in physical form anymore.
Someone suffering from ALS, again,
Right.
very much like the dementia.
Brain injury.
Yeah. Right down to, as you were talking earlier, Julie, before we started recording, even retirement, which can seem so benign and wonderful, but it can also have its own place where loss is present.
And I think, and we'll deal with this in a different podcast, but there is a distinction between ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief.
Yes.
But for today, when we think about that, and you asked for examples, I mean, there's two very obvious ones, and we can talk about them because they're so much in the news, is that there have been two murders in our city in the last 5 years or so, where the person's body has never been recovered. So there's the opposite, where the person is absent, never to be found. That's why there's such a need to find a body. And whether that is, in this case, the murder, but sometimes it is through an accident at sea or a death where the person is missing.
Yeah.
There is such a need to find the body, because this ambiguous loss piece is really unsettling to live with that.
We need the proof. Finding, that's proof that what I thought has happened, and therefore my loss becomes legitimate. My grief becomes okay.
I was going to say, it legitimizes the grief, doesn't it?
I'm now worthy of that support. Right?
Well, it fills in the grief. It fills in that last piece that may need that. And
sometimes I think, in the trauma work that I do, we often talk about needing to establish a coherent narrative, a way to understand what has happened, and that includes also the details, right? And of course we'll never know everything in a situation like that, but even the process of finding a body, or it becomes part of the narrative. If that body is never found, then there's an abyss. It's ambiguous. Like, I'm not trying to be,
it's a story without an ending.
That's right.
Yeah. And I think that in the other way around, where the person is physically present but psychologically absent, such as dementia and Alzheimer's, so often we all hear, "Oh, I've done my grieving ahead of time, so I'm not going to grieve when they die." And I caution them. I say, you can't grieve what you haven't experienced. Your grief that you're experiencing now is real, but it's ambiguous loss grief. That's what you're feeling. You can't feel the grief of somebody dying until they're dead. And then you get that feeling. And we have to deal with grief that says this person is not here any longer physically. The grief you have around ambiguous loss is that sense that the person I know, or I've known all my life, is physically in front of me, but they're not here. But when they die, that physical piece goes too. And so it adds a different piece. So I try to encourage people, the grief you're experiencing during a dementia or Alzheimer experience is real. It needs to be acknowledged as grief. It's loss, but it's this ambiguous loss. It's not a death loss yet.
And I think it's so important for us to just pause on that for a moment, David, because I've heard this from so many clients over the years who will start to judge themselves when they grieve once the person dies. And basically their judgment is, I thought I'd be doing this better. I didn't think I would be so actively grieving because, the person had Alzheimer's for 9 years and, I had already felt like I'd lost my husband during all of that time. But as you said, like, that was lost through that period of time. And there were many losses, and all of that is real. And now this is further loss at this point. But that idea of like, I often say to people, we can't do pain ahead of time. The pain you had then was your pain from that time. This is a different pain. But boy, we really want to do that. And so I've just heard that complicate that judgment of self, that expectation of, I thought my grief would be less, and then I thought I would be, quote, doing better.
Yep. Yeah, there's that the practice. I've practiced this. I've done it. I've got all the tears out. I always say you're going to then grieve just something different. Your grief is going to evolve, right? And I just wanted, Julie, your comments there made me think of, and it's hearkening back to our podcast on guilt, is that quite often in situations like dementia, Alzheimer's, maybe ALS, the person, and sometimes a longer, a slow cancer, there's a sense of, I just wish they would go, right? And that's part of the, and then the guilt that comes from that. But the relief I'm talking about is, I thought I was going to feel relief. And that's a horrible thing to think when my loved one's going to die. They've got Alzheimer's. They don't recognize me. They don't recognize. It's almost like they have died. And the care when that ends is going to be a relief. And then they feel guilty about that thought. And then they realize it isn't a relief because they're just trading the ambiguous grief for the actual real grief of the true loss of the person, both psychologically and physically gone. Yeah.
And I think it's worth that, acknowledging that separation, that two-part. I mean, people tend to de-emphasize the importance of the physical. So they say, well, the person, that they're not really, they're just as like they're dead if they have dementia. They're not here. But the truth is, our physical piece is such a huge, it's how we're known in life. And yes, all of the cognitive, all of those pieces can go from what they used to be. But this physical piece is important. Whether or not we acknowledge it, whether we like the way it looks and changes, it still is part of the identity of that person. So that's why, that part of them has died, but this part hasn't yet. Mm-hmm. And often when you say, Julie, people are surprised, I find that too. But one of the things I will remind them of is to say, the thing is, you knew where your mom was. You could go up to Fairhaven on Tuesday afternoon and visit her. Now you can't do that, right? And that's that you can no longer go there. So they're not here to even visit. And that's the piece that moves it into a real grief, a different grief than, or a different level of grief than it is in an ambiguous loss.
And I really want to, we're speaking here more about the perspective of, the caregiver or the family, the people around the individual. But the individual themselves will also experience ambiguous loss. So I'm thinking the person in the earlier stages of dementia, absolutely, we know, with ALS, with certain kinds of cancers, that feeling of I'm changing. And with that, there's the loss of identity, sometimes our meaning, our purpose, how we just, some of the simple ways that we move through life. I'm thinking, I have a very dear friend who works a lot with people with dementia, and she's told me many stories about, some of these people who have, great expertise, very passionate in a certain area in their life, really, educated, and they were living these thriving lives. And all of a sudden, they might not be driving their car in a year. That's a really significant loss. And so the people around them are experiencing that grief, but the individual is as well. So there's a collective grieving that's happening that's really important that we recognize.
And I think it's easy for us to identify things like dementia and Alzheimer's, but there's so many ways in which this happens, and I think some of them really create difficulties. Things like acquired brain injuries,
yes,
where
absolutely.
The person may look, quote, normal, and yet that brain injury doesn't allow them, or it's changed their whole personalities, or it doesn't allow them to respond in ways that are seemingly appropriate. And so, if I'm a spouse or a parent or a child of somebody who's had an ABI or an acquired brain injury, I'm looking at them and I'm seeing them, but I also am living with this piece that's not really who they are. But other people don't see that. And that makes it really challenging.
Mm-hmm. As you were talking there, I was hearkening back to, I was thinking about those folks that find themselves on the street and addiction, and how, you know, the losses, as you said, Julie, are on both sides. Whether there's parents out there wondering where their child is, their child maybe lost hopes and dreams or a sense of safety and security, or has enough pain that they're searching for something that will take that away. The loss that they might have had from what they had envisioned for themselves as a younger person, and then the reality that they're faced with being so different, and the struggle so real, and the loss is so great.
And I think the other, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but you identified it, Red, and that is, I think, and again, this doesn't necessarily mean it's for every child, but children in the foster care and adopted piece, where this sense of maybe, and things have changed a little bit with adoption, but it used to be much of it closed, and so there was, this loss of knowing of who my birth mom is or my birth dad, and again, everything is done for the quote best of that child, and nobody's making decisions poorly there, but I think there's this normal, natural experience of ambiguous loss of that person that I should know psychologically. I know my mother psychologically. I don't know her, but I have a mother, right? A birth mother, and yet I don't know her. She's not absent or not present, and so even just I have found that even just having that ability to acknowledge that can be such a relief to so many, by saying there was something wrong with me because I was thinking that, but no, this is part of ambiguous loss. And it's part of our life in so many different ways. Yeah.
So on that note, one of the questions I wanted to pose to our little group here is, so what's the work? What's, what do we want to be aware of? How, and for ourselves, and how do we support others where there's ambiguous loss present? Because of course there is. I mean, I think we could go around our little circle here and probably identify places where that's showing up in our lives. And on that note, I just have to say, like the pandemic, there was ambiguous loss happening everywhere all the time. Still is.
I think one of the things to do is, and I'm just going to jump in here first, David, is to treat it as real, to treat it and give it the space. And what popped into my head there when you were speaking, David, is how real this is. And it's the example that's maybe less obvious, the one where the body is gone, but the person is there still psychologically. I had a parent one time tell me that their son had died, but was missing. And when their son's body was found, she said that was the second day he died, right? That's right? Because when they found out he was missing, that was the first day. And if there was anything that's going to make that if you want to know how real it is, for that family now, their son has 2 death dates.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. And so that made it, for me, it was a powerful statement in that in the interim time, there was a true death that was suffered by this family, even though there was no body to actualize what had happened. And then when the body was found weeks later, that was the second time their son died. And for me, that made that sense of ambiguous to acknowledge the first as real, and then generalize that to then all ambiguous grief or loss situations.
It's true. It's good. So Boss would say that the model for working with ambiguous loss is really stress-based, and both in the assessment and in the interventions. So the goal, she would say, is not to cure the ailment,
of course,
but rather to build resilience in order to bear the ambiguity that exists and the uncertainty that exists for years.
Right.
So in that case, how do we sustain these people through that period? And it's the focus there seems to be on how do we build resilience so that they can withstand this ambiguity in a way where it doesn't destroy them.
Right. So what I'm hearing there, David, correct me if I'm wrong, it's that there's no quote kind of cure for the ambiguity. It's what do we build around it and within the person,
Right.
to increase their capacity to carry that incredible burden.
That's it exactly.
Yeah. So how do we do that? What does that look like?
Well, they talk about, I think you both have worked with resilience building, but I think it's more than part of that. I have found with ambiguous loss is that some of the work is really around reconstructing identity, because like all grief, that is an identity piece for us. But in ambiguous loss, the identity piece is there. It might look a little different. So with somebody, for instance, if I have a child who's on the streets addicted to drugs and I don't know where they are, and if somebody asks me, if that's one of my 3 children, how many children do you have? I'm probably more likely to say 3, even although I will cover for that one I don't know where they are. But if a child has died, one of the challenges that parents have is they don't know whether they should even acknowledge that person, right? That they're there. So, but beyond that, it's an identity of who am I now with this ambiguity in my life? Am I, who am I? How do I acknowledge that status of myself? So it does create some challenges in our identity and how we see ourselves in the world and how we think the world sees us in this piece. So, that's certainly one of the pieces. And I'll give one more, and then I'll let you. The other one that I have found is, and this one's really challenging, but to normalize as best we can the ambivalence that's there, and try to find a way to deal with the conflicting feelings that come and uncertainty, and rather than trying to fix those, to find a way to normalize the reality that they're there, and how do we accommodate what seemingly are opposites, and allowing people to find it okay to carry both rather than to fix one of them so I only have the other.
I was just thinking about that, and this includes, for me to tolerate that as the person helping, is to tolerate myself the ambiguity and sit there and bear witness to the tension of carrying all of that I don't try to reduce the problem and start looking for a solution when there isn't one. And I have found that my role in those times is to name the different emotions, like let's name that there's, the frustration. Let's name that there's resentment for the caregiving. Let's name that, right? And let's just make space for it all, that it's not one or the other, right? It's not this or it's that. It's all of those things. And for me, I find the normalizing, and I often start a lot of sentences with, and of course you feel that way, right? That makes sense. That makes sense to me that would be happening for you. That's a simple way, David, moving back to that resiliency, but to feel connected and understood is something that helps us carry such a burden.
Yeah, I think sort of jumping off of that, I think, is helping the person understand, especially if they're in a caregiver role, let's say, that that's not their only identity. It is identity work, but that they are an equal part of their self-care, or of their care, and it's their self-care. Quite often you'll hear, well, I can't do this and I can't do that because I've got to be doing these other tasks, whether, some caregiving task, let's say. And I always try to people to remind them that they're in the equation, that they're not out of the equation because of their role as maybe partner, spouse, caregiver. They are also an individual person that, has to be cared for too. And so, like, an example is like, I couldn't go out for dinner. I don't know when the last time I was out for dinner because I always have to be home to take care of X. And I will say, well, that's good. If X didn't have dementia, would you have gone out for dinner with your friends and not with them ever in your relationship? Well, yeah. And I'll say, so why is it different? Was that good for you? Did you enjoy? Did that sort of feed your soul to go out for dinner with your friends? And that, yeah. So you didn't spend every minute together when health was in the relationship. It's even more important now to know that you need to include yourself in self-care, and that isn't selfish. And to try to say self-care is not selfish. You know, selfish is, this is an old example. I've got 10 chocolate bars and I'm not going to give you any. Self-care is I've taken care of all the responsibilities I have for today, and now I'm going to do something for me. And so allowing people that identity as having a life outside the role of whatever it is that they feel that they're trapped in.
What also goes into that, I would say, Red, and this is part of our work, I think, with people in ambiguous loss, comes around, and this comes out of our attachment theory pieces, of asking them, okay, how are you attached to them now? What, you know, so in that case, in somebody a dimension and caregiver, so you know, the attachment looked different before that, but what's the attachment now look like? Or if it's the other way in which we don't know where they are and they're psychologically here, how do I help work through what's that attachment look like now? You can't physically hug them, so you can't attach to them the way you used to be able to attach to them. So how do we adjust this attachment piece that allows for the reality of what we're experiencing in this moment? And I think the example you gave is where that adjustment hasn't been made. We're still trying to attach like we used to where we feel the responsibility of having to look after everything, whereas the attachment that we need to do allows for self-care, allows us to feel that piece is okay. So there is some work to do around the attachment pieces that I think are important.
That's so funny because way back in my early career, working in children's mental health, working in a treatment foster care setting, we created a therapeutic memory book just so that, you think about it, the cons, and it was under the work of trying to, under the umbrella of attachment, right? And to give that person, that child, their history, because quite often they don't even have a history. You'll have a 10-year-old child who has had 13 placements in the last 6 years and 13 schools, and they've lost their sense of connectedness to anything, right? And so that concept of allowing the resilience was to try to give some level of continuity, to give that person their history, to give that person their life so that they can remember it. And I think that it's the same thing here. If it's a dementia or an acquired brain injury, that you have to be able to give the person their life. And Julie, you said earlier, it's not just this moment in time. You had a full life, and all your memories need to be included inside that full life. It just hasn't been the last period of time where illness or ill health has entered into your family, and so that you are still that strong person. And you were strong because you were kind to yourself and gave yourself permission to do things that were good for you. And sometimes when we lose that, we need to be reminded that we can build resilience by treating ourselves better, treating ourselves if we put the same effort into treating ourselves as we did the other, boy, wouldn't we be good? We don't have that time, and we don't sometimes have the energy. Sometimes making that time to do something for yourself feels like too much work. But we don't realize at the time that the give back or the get back from that is tenfold, right?
So I think, on that note, I was just thinking, if you're supporting someone who is in a place, carrying ambiguous loss, one of the things we can do is, obviously we're going to check in, we're going to ask how that person's doing, but allow them to still talk, to still not just talk about the loss, but that person, right? So I think of some of the caregivers I work with where we're talking about, the burden of caregiving now, but I'll also make sure that we try to toggle back and forth around, help me understand who he was when you first met him, what your marriage was like, what you were like as parents. And because they weren't always a caregiver, and this person wasn't always the person with Alzheimer's, right? And so again, that's the fullness of the life. So I'm checking in on, to provide support in the here and now as they travel this part of the journey, but remembering there's a whole big part of the story of the journey prior to this, and we want to make sure that we honor that as well.
And I think that's so important. And it kind of leads to this one, which is much more difficult. And that is that, can we find a sense of meaning in what we're experiencing in the moment? I think that finding meaning in where we are in life builds resilience. But that's a very tricky one.
It's tricky and it's hard going.
And it's not a matter of saying to people, oh, wow, look at all the good things that are coming up. Like, it's not as easy. No. But it is important that somewhere to find a sense of meaning that allows me to see this part of life as not totally despair. I mean, I have friends who, his mother is in dementia and Alzheimer, but he says, I just love visiting her. He said, I know, I went through all the grief and the sadness of watching, but we have so much fun. He said, she hasn't lost her humor. She doesn't know me half the time, but he said, I just enjoy that interaction, watching her express her humor, not because of me, but because of her. Now, this is not easy to find. Oh my gosh.
Well, and I want to say that the meaning comes, the person finds the meaning. We do not project meaning onto people.
Absolutely.
That's silver lining.
Yep.
That doesn't work, and that's diminishing.
Exactly.
But I'm thinking of one person that I worked with through over a very long period of time, and I had to really resist. Don't problem solve, Julie. Don't try to find the meaning for her. And over a very long period of time, I could see something was changing in her, and she would come in and she'd say things like, "You know what? I feel like I'm a kinder, more patient person. I've never been very, very patient person, like in the way that I parented or whatever." And she was actually caring for like 3 elderly people. And over time, she started to go, it's teaching me something, and it's still hard, and I'm exhausted. So, right. So we're not silver lining, but I could see something was shifting in her over that time. And what was important was that I didn't give that to her. That started to reveal itself to her. But that was because I stayed with her in that, and I resisted my urge to try to problem solve, because it's very hard supporting people in ambiguous loss, because it's ambiguous. There's no end to it. It's uncertain. It's pretty topsy-turvy, right? And you see the person carrying this tremendous burden, and you want to give them some relief. And sometimes the relief isn't there other than just to say, I'll just walk a few steps with you.
But I think that is the key, is finding ways to encourage and develop what they need to allow them to live with that ambiguity the best they can, and not to allow that to overwhelm them. And so that's kind of why it's not a relational piece fixing, like grief is about the relationship. This ambiguous loss is about what we're carrying because of the way the situation is in life.
The idea of invisibility is just coming up to me, and from what you guys have just said, and that sense that, and I don't, it should never be the person's responsibility, but because it's invisible, there is no funeral, there is no wake, there is no procession through town to the cemetery, there is no place to go with a marker made of marble in a yard with other markers made of marble to stand at a graveside. That it might be sometimes the person has to, maybe with really trusted people and safe people in their lives, to say, I really, I need a hand at this point. Because it's invisible, you may not be seeing it. You may not be noticing it. And that's a hard thing to do, to say, I need help. But sometimes that's that vulnerability, being vulnerable and just saying, can you give me a hand? I just need a hand at this moment, because it is invisible and it's hard for people to see, and it's not recognized. And so if it's not shared somehow, then you can be really left alone. And so I think there's a potential of sharing involved in the resilience, so that it isn't invisible for some important people in your life and they get it.
And I think I would just say my final thought today is, and to also remember what Red just said, we can do that for ourselves. We can also, it can be helpful and empowering just to name it for ourselves. So yes, to say it out to others, but on those days where that feel hard, that you feel very kind of weighty, fatigued, and all of those things that go along with grief, is to just remember, I'm grieving. I'm grieving. Yes, no, there isn't a body here. There's not a marker, but I'm grieving. Any final thoughts, David?
Oh, you've said it well, and I just encourage people to validate and recognize that that's part of life, and to find a way to be not comfortable, but to find a way to live with these opposites in our feelings, and not feel the need to get rid of one, but that both may be present, and that's okay. That's all okay.
And I think it's okay to try to search for meaning in it. Right? I think that's an important piece.
And the meaning comes through staying in the process with it. Yeah. We can't, it often finds us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough. Music by Paradise Garage, and technical support provided by Sean Heichert. What Now is recorded at Thin Space Studio. You can find more episodes of What Now for free on major podcast platforms, including Spotify, CastBox, Apple Podcasts, and Overcast. If you want to support us, please follow and leave a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. And tell your friends. It does make a difference.